Hi everybody, and welcome to another preview by ThinkerThemer. I'm Amy, this is my wife Maggie, and together we review games from two different perspectives. I'm all about the mechanics and Maggie is all about the theme. Today we're very excited to be previewing for you Empire's End, the new title by John DeClaire from Brotherwise Games. So let's get into it.
All right, so in Empire's End, we are the ruler of an empire. And unfortunately, we're taking over at the time where there's going to be a lot of calamities coming our way. And so we're going to try and stave off famine and stave off fires and plagues and all sorts of things to make sure that we don't destroy or damage our city in any way. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be a little bit impossible. So it's going to get to the point where we're going to have to go, okay, well, what can I sacrifice? Because everything is going to have its own value. And so ultimately, at the end of the game, whoever manages to salvage and keep in place as much valuable lands as possible, but also cleverly build or construct different buildings that will give us kind of advantages or points at the end of the game, will be the winner.
Now, the way that this game works is really all about bidding. And in this game, you're going to have a randomized setup of all of the assets available to you in your current empire. One player, the first player, is going to randomize the order of these different types of areas, and every other player is going to set up their empire to look exactly the same in the beginning. Now, there are three main types of resources in this game. There are axes, there are hammers, and there is wheat, and then there is gold, which acts as a wild resource for any one of the other three. These resources, or the number of them and the types you have, are always hidden behind this little player screen, which I'm just going to remove so it's easier to see everything at the moment. Now, the way the game works is this little timer marker is going to be moving along a track and triggering a different type of event at every step. Once the timer reaches the end, the game will be complete. But along the way, there are many different types of event. The main type of event is a disaster. When a disaster hits, we're going to turn over the top of the disaster deck and it's going to reveal a card that tells us the position of one of your key assets here that is going to be in danger. So in this example, there is a flood occurring and it's impacting on number 7. So we would find number 7, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 out of 11, and we would place a disaster token on there to show other players that this is the one that you are potentially going to lose if you lose the bid. The reason why we use these markers is because later in the game you do have the opportunity to swap position of locations, which then of course can mean that every player is dealing with a different setup. So we place this down and you can see that there are resources depicted on this card, in this case the grain and the hammer. Now every player in turn order has to place one of those resources on the card in order to keep it away from them. Now if you get to the point where you don't have any of the resources to pay for that disaster, or you just decide that, you know what, 7 is not that valuable to me, I guess I could afford to lose that location, you would take this and it grants you all of the resources that everybody has placed on top of that disaster card, but you need to destroy that location. And you can see in the top left-hand corner, you're losing a lot of victory points for losing that location. Likewise, as the game progresses, if you take this disaster, you also get to add the innovation that's at the bottom of the card. In this case, it's an end game condition to one of your healthy locations. So it slides under the bottom here and is now active. However, if this location was to burn down later in the game, you no longer have access to that end game condition. So it's about carefully balancing your tableau with benefits and being willing to lose things at a time where you need resources, or you just decide that maybe you can let go of that one location. However, this is key, these resources are also useful for other types of events in the game. So there is a conflict event as well where you need military, and military is depicted on your army location. So at the moment I have 4 built in, but you can add to that by secretly bidding a number of axes. We are going to resolve a conflict card at this point in the game that shows you the amount of victory points and bonuses that you'll get for whatever number of military you're able to contribute in secret, and we all reveal at the same time, and the person who has the most is going to get an extra bonus. And then we have the tools. The tools are also, or the hammer, I should say. The hammer is also really useful because the hammer can allow you to rebuild locations when we go to this industry event here. So you can see my town, which cost me 25 victory points to burn down, costs 10 hammers in order to rebuild. So when we have this type of event, you have the opportunity to rebuild one location if you want to. The other thing that you can do is you can also build innovations from your hand of cards. So everyone is going to start with 4 cards, and some of these have different innovations on them for military or end game scoring conditions, or the economy phase, which I'll talk about in a moment. And it will allow you to build innovations underneath your healthy locations and therefore build up that kind of engine you have going to get more resources. And that brings me to the final type of event, that is the economy event. Economy is going to give you more resources according to the resources that are depicted on your healthy locations. So we want to make sure that we keep these farms and roads alive so that we can get more of these resources, so that we have the opportunity to rebuild or to win at war, or to just stave off those horrendous disasters from taking out more of our little engine tableau. Now, please remember that everything you see here is in prototype form, as well as the rule set. So please be sure to check out the campaign page when it goes live. But for now, let's talk about how we felt about the game as is.
Let's talk about it. So, yes, well, obviously this game is very much, it reminded me a lot of No Thanks, which you haven't played, but I actually really enjoy, which is a very, very, very simple game. But it's the same concept of there's a card that you don't want, and so you're going to want to, put some resources on it to make it go away. And as it's going around and around and around, the card itself is becoming more and more valuable, or not so much valuable, but less bad and a little bit attractive, because it's got such a pile of resources amassing on it. And so that becomes this sort of interesting, like, oh, okay, well, maybe now I'll give in and I'll get that because I can kind of use it in other ways. That's always, like, as a core thing, that I find that as a really, like, interesting and fun element.
It is so tense. That is, when you're playing this game, it feels excruciating because you start with all of these victory points, so many victory points, and it's hard to wrap your head around the idea that you're probably going to lose at least half of your locations.
Very likely.
And it's annoying and it's stressful. And when we have these disasters which pop up so frequently, much more frequently than your opportunity to gain new resources,
it's relentless.
It is relentless, and it feels like your empire is coming to an end. And it's just super interesting the way this works, that whenever you reveal a new card and a new location is, potentially going to burn down, I think the tension is so interesting because there's a couple of things you have to think about. One, could I afford to lose this one in order to gain all of the resources that everybody has bid on there? And that itself becomes a little bit of a mini game of trying to bluff your friends around the table, because you're like, oh, maybe I don't want this, so I'm just going to keep adding resources to it. But maybe I secretly do want to take it, but I'm trying to make everybody else not want it, and keep piling on resources so that at the point when I do take it, it has this bounty of resources. So you're trying to kind of push your luck a little bit in terms of, like, bluffing that you're not going to take it.
Also, the fact they have these screens mean that sometimes there's people around the table that have very little, and they might only be able to kind of go 1 or 2 rounds, and they're just kind of hoping that someone else will cave first. Which is really brilliant. Obviously, like, this is being a prototype. Like, these are just at the moment paper, so it's a little bit flimsy. But it does I tend to not enjoy when there's a kind of like a cover, but it really does help with this game because it adds this whole element, as you said, of bluffing.
Yeah, exactly. You have no idea the capacity of someone to stay in the bid.
Yeah.
And
there's that whole thing of like, I'm going to put all my stuff in it if it means that like you're going to have to destroy that one, area that I know that you're so invested in.
Yeah, but that's the other thing is not all of your stuff at once. You can only ever contribute one resource to move it on from that round to pass, essentially. You need to pay the resource. And that's what builds in that tension is just who can last in the round the longest or who's going to cave as that pile becomes more and more attractive. And the other thing I really like about the game is that in these kind of industry rounds, there is an ability that allows you to swap your locations around. And because even though the number, so there's obviously locations 1 to 11, but they are in this deck multiple times. And so you can kind of feel like, oh, well, number 3 just came up, so it's probably unlikely to come up again. So I might swap something really valuable into number 3. You might do that. You might try and like hedge your bets a little bit.
It's still quite big though. I find that it's like we have friends that are like, oh, maybe statistically, surely it's not gonna, and it's like, but it does.
It can still come up again.
It's like
for
roulette.
Sure.
People go, oh, that's come out a lot. Surely it's not going to come out again. It's just luck.
Yeah.
Luck is,
I don't know, because it's only in there a certain number of times. And so it does lower the odds of it coming out again slightly. But the other thing is that some of the technologies have adjacencies. And sometimes if you want one thing to activate another thing next to it, and then one of them burns down, for example, you might need to shift things around so that you're optimizing your tableau. And so shifting your locations around is important, but that means that when we're bidding on number 4, maybe it's something really powerful for me, and maybe it's something that Maggie can afford to lose, but she's going to keep pushing me because she's like, well, I could take that, or I could force Amy to lose, 32 victory points. And so that becomes this like, oh, maybe we should just like push Amy to lose those victory points. And so that social dynamic is really fun.
Another element that I like about the bidding is that sometimes it's really about whatever innovation that card is going to give you. Because usually we only have very few building opportunities where you get to build the cards that are in your hand. But every card that you collect that is going to, cause you a disaster, gets to be built straight away. So it's like, that's another way of kind of building up your tableau. And sometimes, it can come down to that. Like it can come down to, I really want, I'm really trying to keep my economy or like my green areas alive, because every time that triggers, I really want to get a lot of bounty from it. And this is going to be the only way that I get access. So maybe I am invested in that, not so much from the one that it's going to destroy, but more from the synergies. Also, towards the end of the game, I found like with the end game abilities, some of them can be really, really powerful. For example, some of them will give you points for every grain that you have accumulated at the end. Aside from that, these resources don't give you anything. So if you end up with this pile of resources, it's worthless. But if I have one of those cards, one of those innovations, that all of a sudden I ended up getting one of those cards with like, it had like this tower of grain on it. And then I had that, 1 point per every grain. It's like, this is fantastic.
Exactly, but it's also so clever that the end game conditions are built into healthy locations, because if that location becomes at risk, you're like, not only am I going to lose the victory points on that location, but I'm going to lose my end game scoring ability, and that is so painful. There's also another type of card that I absolutely love. I just happened to grab one just then, which is this type of benefit or innovation that activates during the disaster phase. So during that bidding round, if I had have built this here, I can add one of these white cubes onto here to say that I don't need to pay a grain and essentially just skip my bid. And that, as you can imagine, is really useful because not only am I not having to spend a grain, but I'm also not giving my opponent, who's hopefully going to take that disaster card, an extra grain. And then during the economy phase, if you have this cleverly placed next to a road that has this ability, you will be able to remove that in order to use it again. If you don't place it there cleverly, or if something something burns down, like this road burns down, that cube's going to stay there forever. And so you just have to be really smart about the adjacencies, which is something that I really appreciate about the design.
Now, before I actually talk about how this game made me feel, I need to preface that with my player preferences, essentially, which is I like to build things. I like to create things. I like starting from zero or very little, and then by the end of it, sort of step back and go, look what I've created, look what, what has come to life. And this game very much goes against that. You start out with this beautiful empire, and little by little, or sometimes not so little, sometimes relentlessly, it just destroys. You just start seeing everything go red and devastation and just fire and awfulness. And so the whole time I find myself kind of going, no. It's like it's that feeling over and over again. And so when one of those cards kind of comes around, you're like, I really can't afford it in terms of like the devastation, but I also potentially can't afford it in terms of the resources. And so you do feel the excruciating end of your empire that is collapsing, which is a feeling that I don't enjoy.
Yeah, it really is the opposite of Civ building, and it always feels painful. It's just about whether it is less painful than an alternative painful later in the game. And so it does always feel like that when you have to take this, it always feels like a compromise. Even though you get all these great resources, it's still like, but I am losing something, and that is not going to be to everybody's taste. In fact, we played this with many different players at many different player counts, and found that probably half of the people we played with found it as painful as Maggie from an emotional perspective. So if you are the type of player that really doesn't like your sandcastle being kicked down, this feels like the game is doing that to you.
Over and over and over again.
Not necessarily other players, although I will say that because they're bidding and because sometimes you'll have the most valuable thing that might be destroyed, there is a little bit of there can be a little bit of table talk of like, well, let's take Amy's 32 down, let's just keep bidding. So, that can be a negative experience as well. So you have to be a player that is okay with destruction, essentially. I am not as sensitive to that as Maggie. I approach it from a very much a puzzle perspective of like, what can I afford to lose, and what can I, what do I really want to save? And from that perspective, mechanically, it is really interesting. And if you are a fan of bidding games, or you don't mind that level of destruction, it's just a really fascinating game. I also like the way that the scaling works in terms of player count. So this is the 2-player side of the board. If we flip the board, it has another side for 3 or 4 players, and some of the different disasters only apply for a 3 or a 4-player count. And if you see for a 4-player game, you are just facing more and more and more disasters.
Double disasters.
And double disasters that occur at the same time, where you need to pay 2 resources to get rid of both of them or to pass on your turn. And that's interesting because obviously in a bidding game, in just 2 players, one of you is going to have to take that disaster. In a 4-player game, you can actually avoid taking more disasters because there are more people who might cave in and take it. And so...
But also by the time that disaster comes to you, it usually has a lot more goodies on it.
So it looks more valuable as well. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it at all player counts. Probably my favorite was maybe 3. 4 was also quite interesting, but it felt a little bit long just because there's so many disasters to get through. But, I feel like the more people, kind of the better because of that pile of resources. It feels less painful because you're getting more stuff.
Interestingly for me, I preferred it at the 4-player count. That would probably be the only way that I would get this to the table, because it meant that the devastation of taking one of those cards and having to destroy your beautiful empire at least was kind of balanced with the card usually by that point had a lot more stuff on it. So it felt like less of a devastating hit. And also because there's more, even though there's more, double disasters, it kind of felt like the despair was spread around a bit more than in even the 3 or 2 players.
I agree with that. And of course, there's the military conflict where you're all bidding and revealing at the same time. That becomes more fun with more people. In a 2-player game, it's more like a push and pull in every sense for every part of the game. So it is better suited, I think, to a higher player count. And the final thing I want to mention is there will be a natural comparison to John DeClare's previous title, Space Base, because the locations, these skinny locations, they look pretty similar to the Space Base cards, but the two games feel very different to play. This game is really about tearing things down. Space Base is all about building up your tableau, and this game has bidding at the center of it, whereas Space Base, you're rolling dice and deciding how to allocate those dice to your tableau. So mechanically and emotionally, the game feels very different, and we hope that this preview has helped you decide whether Empire's End is right for you. Please help us to continue making these unpaid independent previews by liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll be back with more board game content soon. But otherwise, bye for now. Bye.